Good morning, 8th grade. If you're wondering why am I in my car, it's because I'm at In-N-Out and there's a really long line. So I decided might as well just make a video here rather than waste time when I get home. So yesterday we talked about slaves and how free African Americans were treated and how they were treated. It was just very bad, how they faced discrimination, humility, and all that stuff. Today we're going to jump into a new section and we are going to talk about what was it really like to be a slave and working in the fields. So I'm going to give you some background, and I think based off what we've learned in the past and from what I'm telling you today, you'll get an idea of what slavery was like and what it was like to work in the fields. So let's go ahead and get into the slave system. Alright, so today we are going to start a new section. It's called Slave System, and we're going to really find out what was it really like to live a day in a life as a slave. How are slaves treated? What was the slave culture? Everything like that. So we're going to be put into the feet or in the shoes of a slave. Okay? So building background. While most white southern farmers were not slaveholders, like we learned in the past or learned in the previous lesson, only the plantations or the planters had a lot of slaves. The southern economy depended on the work of slaves. This was true not only on large plantations, but also on smaller farms and in the cities. Few chances existed for enslaved African Americans to escape their hard lives. So we've been talking about how they've been treated, what they were used for, what people thought of them, and today we're just going to go and really see the slave perspective. So most enslaved African Americans, they lived in rural areas where they worked on farms and on plantations. Some of these farms or some of these slaves actually worked on small farms as well. And when the people that worked on small farms, since they were small farms, they were in charge of performing a variety of different jobs. Okay, on the large plantations, most slaves were assigned to specific jobs because it was so large. So certain slaves were specifically assigned to these jobs, but most of them worked in the fields. Most slaves holders, they demanded slaves to work as much as possible. It didn't matter if you were sick, if you were tired, hot, anything like that. All slaves were demanded to work to their best of their ability. And if they didn't, this is when punishment would come on. Supervisors, known as drivers, so they had these people called drivers. They were also slaves, but not always were they slaves, but these drivers, they were the ones that made sure that the slaves followed all directions, followed all orders, and if they needed to be punished, these drivers or these people would be the ones that were punishing the slaves. So the drivers were pretty much working out there in the fields with the slaves, supervising them, making sure everything was getting done. Most plantation owners, they used the system called the gang labor system. In this system, it was pretty much all field hands worked on the same task at a time. So if they were picking cotton, everyone was picking cotton. If they were watering, everybody was watering. So they usually worked in this gang style mentality where everyone did everything together and they all tackled the same task so they can move on. Typically, they worked from sunup to sundown, and they never had a break. They didn't even get a break to eat lunch. During lunch, they would pretty much have to work and eat at the same time. They never really got a break, okay? And the food that they ate wasn't good at all. It was scraps. And typically, they were just getting the bottom of the barrel food, and really, they weren't even getting nutrition. So men, women, and even children about the age of 10, they all worked together and they all performed the same task. It didn't matter if they were sick, if the weather was horrible, if it was hot, if it was rainy. It didn't matter. Work needed to continue because cotton, remember, needed a lot of care and attention. So they needed these people out there. And this is horrible because there was no exceptions. Imagine being 10 years old and working as a slave. You got no breaks, no lunch breaks, nothing. It was just work for about 12 hours a day. Some slaves, they actually got to work as butlers, cooks, or nurses in the planter's home. So in the plantation's home, they also had slaves that worked inside. These slaves, they often had better food, clothing, and shelter, but they were still had to work long hours and still treated the same. Sometimes working in the planter's house was even worse because you were on call or you had to work 24 hours a day. Even though you got better treatment, you still were responsible for working. And if you've seen that movie right there, The Butler, it had a whole movie about being a slave butler. So even though you had perks, it still wasn't the best option. On larger plantations, some of these slaves had skilled jobs. These were like the people that could buy their freedom, like we were talking about yesterday. where these slaves, they were so skilled at either crafting things, making things, that people decided that they would pay them a little bit amount of money. If they had these jobs, typically what would happen was the planters would take some of the money and they would allow the slaves to keep some of the money to allow them to keep making it, but they didn't really get a lot of money. Also, these slaves, when they did this, they were able to start to save up money, and hopefully the goal was for them to save enough money so they can buy their freedom. This really happened. This was very rare, but it was possible for slaves to buy their freedom. But like we said before, it's very tough, because when slaves buy their freedom, we know that they could easily be kidnapped and be sold right back into slavery. Also, slaves that had special skills and were very skilled, people were able to sell these slaves at a more expensive cost, and they would make more money if they sold these slaves. So it was very hard for them to actually buy their freedom, because what's the use of letting them free if they're valuable to everybody else? So today we talked about the variety of jobs that slaves had and where they did. So typically on a small plantation or a small farm, slaves had a variety of jobs. They had to do everything to support the small farms. It didn't matter how old you were, or it did matter if you were 10 and above, men or women, everyone was expected to work and work hard. On large plantations, they used this thing called the gang system, where they were able to all accomplish one task at a time, but they always had to work from sunup to sundown with no breaks. Didn't matter if it was raining, if it was hot, if they were sick, if they were injured, slaves had to work. And if you did not work, this is when the punishments start to sit in, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But yeah, so they did perform these jobs. Some slaves, they actually got to work in the planter's house as butlers, cooks, and nurses. Even though they got better food, better clothes, and everything like that, they were still treated very bad, because they had to work 24 hours a day. We also talked about some of the skilled laborers. Some of these skilled workers, they were able to get money for their skills and buy their freedom, but this is very rare, because remember, if you were skilled and you were valuable, you were worth more money to these slave owners. So they would try to sell you off or keep you for as long as possible. So these are some of the jobs that we performed, or the slaves performed. For homework, I would like you guys to answer these questions. Number 1, what was work in the field like for an enslaved African? So based off what you know, what would it be like to work in a field? Number 2, how is life different for slaves working in the planter's house? And number 3, how were some skilled slaves able to buy their freedom? So these are your questions for today. So that concludes our lesson for today. If you're wondering, I am in the drive-thru of In-N-Out, but since the line was so long, I decided might as well just make a video here for you guys. So if you guys have any questions whatsoever, please send me a message and I can help you out that way. If not, don't forget, tomorrow at 10 a.m. we are going to have a game day, and I'm looking forward to seeing you guys all there. Okay? With that being said, I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys all tomorrow. And I'll enjoy my In-N-Out for you.